So Chris, welcome.
That's great to be here.
It's great to be with someone who was our DC editor for a few years and who's bringing your intellectual firepower to TV and doing it with integrity and empathy and fairness in ways that I think the elites wouldn't be as strong as they were if we had more shows like yours. So I want to talk about your book, Twilight of the Elites. So you call this, first decade of the 21st century the fail decade. It's a provocative suggestion. What are some key examples that define and set this decade apart?
So the reason I call it that, and the reason that I spend some time in the first chapter in a somewhat macabre fashion running through this cascade of corruption and incompetence and institutional failure is because I think if you're writing a work of social criticism, the first response is, well, aren't things always messed up in some way? Yeah. And it's true. Every era has its own pathologies, and the role of social critic is there's always a room for a social critic. But I do think that if you take a step back and you think from the contested, arguably unfairly awarded result of the presidential election in 2000 to the failure of the largest security apparatus in the history of human civilization, which is the American security apparatus, to prevent 9/11, into the Iraq War. Right after the Iraq War, we had Enron, which has been completely removed from our memory because it's been overshadowed by the devastation that would follow. The war bogging down, watching an American city in New Orleans during Katrina drown on national television while we watched helpless, into the subprime and bursting of the housing bubble and the greatest financial crisis in 70 years. At the end of that, what you have is a landscape in which every pillar institution in the society is discredited. Everything from Major League Baseball to the Catholic Church, to the big three automakers, to newspapers, to Congress, to Wall Street. We have historically low levels of public trust in our institutions. And I think we need to sort of look squarely at that when we're assessing where we are right now as a country.
Well, you cite in a provocative, important way Desmond Tutu's observation that apartheid dehumanized whites as well as blacks in South Africa, and that you argue that extreme inequality has produced pathologies in our elites, and one of those is this cult of smartness that actually stunts independent thinking. How so? A few examples. Jamie Dimon, after all, was considered the smartest banker on the street.
Barack Obama just said in an interview a week ago, he's one of our smartest bankers we have. And I think he probably is. I mean, I don't know him personally, but from everything I've read in reporting and talking to people that do have interact with him, he's an exceptionally bright individual. I'm glad you read the Desmond Tutu quote, because in some ways I think that's the most important quote in the whole book. That insight that systems of inequality bring out the worst in the people atop the order, as much as they do dehumanize and immiserate people on the bottom. And the core argument that I'm making in the book about inequality, I think, is a relatively novel argument insofar as when we talk about inequality, we talk about why it's bad for people at the bottom of the social pyramid. And I don't really talk that much in the book about that. I talk about how it makes people at the top worse. Right. The cult of smartness, I think, is a kind of fetishization of intellectual firepower and a belief that smartness is a kind of ordinal, rankable quality, like height. Michael Jordan is taller than Danny DeVito, and Yao Ming is taller than Michael Jordan, and so is smarter than so-and-so. And what it ends up doing is it obviously smartness is necessary for good leadership and decision-making, but it's not sufficient. And if you only value smartness, you can end up with very perverse consequences. You enable people that have what I call destructive intelligence, people that lack things like compassion, empathy, judgment, prudence, but are extremely smart. David Addington's a great example of this.
Cheney's close counselor.
Cheney, he was
during the Iraq War
general counsel for Vice President Cheney, and then as chief of staff after the Scooter Libby imbroglio. By all accounts, by everyone that's ever interacted with the man, just exceptionally bright, exceptionally smart. And also someone who pursued the most destructively maximalist interpretation of executive power, push for torture, push for warrantless wiretapping. And he was able to win arguments largely because of the dynamics of elite culture fetishize that smartness so much that it trumps other considerations.
I valued your discussion in the book about Sonia Sotomayor in the context of this, how we make a fetish of certain kinds of smartness. And it is ironic sitting with you because you are considered very, very smart and have intellectual firepower, but you do, I think as Sonia Sotomayor did, she brings a life experience, fairness, empathy. and a set of values that is often excluded from an elite circle. Question, I've didn't know this, but I've learned hanging out with you in different places. You consider climate crisis probably the greatest existential threat confronting this country in this failed decade and onwards. So here's an issue that even more than sexual abuse, you write about it in the context of the church in your book, or foreign wars, the debacle of Iraq, that directly threatens the elites as well as everyone else. So why is the elite political class failing to act for their self-preservation? What does that tell us about them and our system?
That's a great question. It's a really important one. Sometimes I think, part of the problem with our elites are that they don't even do the job we want elites to do, right? I mean, if you're gonna, in that way, Mayor Bloomberg, for all the issues I have with Mayor Bloomberg, he's a true elitist in ways that are both maddening and anti-democratic, and also ways that are
humane.
kind of amazing,
the fight
right?
Against obesity and what he did this past
because
year.
He's able to take these unpopular positions, and it can be paternalizing and it can be patronizing, but at least he has both sides of that aspect to him. I think that you see such a focus on the short-term pursuit of power, money, and status among the current elite, and I think elements of the meritocracy and our what I call fractal inequality, right, which is this inequality that, even if you think, I'm in the top 2%, you feel as far from the 1%, right?
Yes, that's space.
Exactly, because it's always going up, right? You went to law school at Harvard and you're working as a partner and you're making $500,000 a year,
slows or closes.
And some other guy's making $10 million in a hedge fund. You think, oh man. All of that, I think, does create these sort of incentives for short-term pursuit of status and power and wealth, and not the kind of security to even pursue some enlightened vision of noblesse oblige, which is what we would like. Exactly.
Or generations to come.
Right.
There among readers of The Nation who valued your essay, and I'm sure they'll read the book as a result. One of them wrote, "We seek a cure." Not sure what the cures are, but you do interestingly end your book, and I know it's more a social critique than a manifesto. That's not your style as of yet. But you end the book with the suggestion that the hope for transformation rests with the newly radicalized upper middle class. Why them in particular? Why not the middle class, the working class, the poor?
Partly, I think that the process of the post-meritocratic rise in inequality that we've seen starting around the 1970s to now, and people have written about this era a lot. Timothy Noah's got a great book out about it. Paul Krugman's written about it. Deindustrialization, the fraying of the social safety net, austerity, that has been hitting people at the bottom of the social pyramid for a long time. The expansion of the war on drugs and criminalization of young black men, for instance. The decline of manufacturing and factories has hit the working class, right? The decline of unionization. So in some ways, the effects of the crisis on those portions of society are less new. They've had it bad for a while. The place where there's the rupture and the disruption is, I think, among the upper middle class. Those are the people who are most proximate to those at the very top making the gains. You might be broadly in one social circle. Like I said, you went to law school with someone who's now a hedge funder, right? And I think also those are people with a fair amount of social capital and a kind of sense of entitlement. And a sense of entitlement is an important thing in people who want to disrupt the system.
It's a sense of empowerment if used and channeled and thought through. A personal question, though. One of the things I loved about the book was your wrestling with the beyond left-right mantra. And I don't say that glibly, but you posit two sort of agents of change, insurrectionists and institutionalists. Insurrectionists, Paul Krugman is one now. He wasn't, but he wants to kind of rethink, reimagine, reinvent these structures of our society. Institutionalists, well, David Brooks, certainly one. And today is the classic institutionalist column, sort of Edmund Burke, 2012, wants to protect the status quo. But you wrestle with those two because you don't see, you're not a direct insurrectionist, you're not an institutionalist, nor is Noam Chomsky someone you quote, who worries also, I think, in the context of climate change. If we don't have a, quote, elite or scientific elite, where do we go with? So I'm just curious, how do you wrestle with that in your work, your life? Where do you come down as you look forward at the political possibilities in our country and social economic possibilities?
I think you put your finger on one of the central debates within myself that plays out in the book, is that the book has some very strong radical impulses, and it has some more. Someone even said this is, accused me of being just a conventional liberal, and in some ways I am just kind of a Rawlsian liberal, but conventional Rawlsian liberalism in these times is pretty radical because we've abandoned that vision. We've completely abandoned that vision. So I think I used to be less concerned about things like the decline of trust in things like the media, or even things that used to strike me as totally bougie concerns like bipartisanship and comity and civility. All those used to seem like excuses for a bankrupt status quo. But I do worry now, and partly this is because of climate change. I think if we don't have any central repository of institutional authority in the society, it's extremely hard to communicate to people the stakes of this invisible process that's taking place. But just generally social change. I mean, I read this book, The Race Beat, which won the Pulitzer. I cited in Twilight of the Elites. And it's a book about the ways in which the civil rights movement interacted with particularly the northern white press, and the degree to which they understood that swaying public opinion, particularly in the North, among a fairly disengaged northern white citizens, was through the media. And that media was very concentrated and was commanding a lot of trust. It was sort of the high point of, you had the Cronkite and the CBS Evening News had more people watching it than all three networks do now combined, the New York Times. And one wonders if you need central repositories of institutional trust like that to get the level of social change that we want and need. It's hard to go back and try to rerun the experiment of the civil rights era and the transformation in public attitudes that came about without the centrality
and some repository of trust and authority.
Exactly. I mean, if you think about running it now, you'd have blogs and Fox and
think about running a whole set. You can do a lot of thought experiments. What if, like Watergate today, would be fractured and parsed in ways that would
those
lose
moments,
its impact.
a lot of what the civil rights, and I don't want to, the civil rights movement succeeded because people demanded their rights with tremendous courage and persistence and all these things. But it did help. And they were very aware of this. I mean, the organizers understood.
Writes about, they were very aware of the power of the media images.
And winning over the establishment, frankly, the northern white establishment. They understood that.
So is there any institution that is kind of meritocratic institution that has escaped this cycle of failure?
So I was having a conversation with Chris Mooney today, who's a great science reporter, who was making the argument that science has, and I think that's actually a good case, that there are certain egalitarian impulses in the way the scientific method works, in the give and take of science, that insulates it from some of the commercial incentives that have caused corruption in other areas, and that doesn't allow this kind of elite inequality to grow up. So I think there's a case to be made there. I also think, if you look at the most trusted institution in American life, which is the military, it is, in its functioning, a sort of remarkably egalitarian place, particularly in comparison to American life. Everybody on the base sends their kid to the same school, right? No matter the rank. That's not the way it works in New York at all.
No.
So there's large central provisionings of public goods within the University of the United States Armed Forces that create a kind of coherence and shrink social distance. And I think that's there's something to that in terms of the degree to which we view that institution as functioning well.
Let me ask a last question. A reader, we solicited comments from Facebook on the comments page and also by email, and a reader writes in and cites Murray Bookchin, someone who was very much like, small is beautiful. He was kind of quasi-anarchist, who's had ideas about municipal libertarianism. And just wondering, this reader seeks a cure. What can make our system less less one of cycles of failure, cults of smartness that don't serve people? And do we go back to the roots, localities? What is there in your book that offers a change?
I think there's an impulse among some people, both sort of libertarians, some folks in Occupy Wall Street, techno-utopians, towards a world in which we don't have large mediating institutions, in which the internet and technology empower people to function without them and to create associations of consent and like-minded interest. And I understand there's something seductive and appealing about that vision, and that might end up being what is best. I think my own sense is that we're all engaged collectively in the social project of self-governance. and there's no way to remove ourselves from that. And I think that the society needs a kind of epidemic of redemocratization. But redemocratization doesn't mean withdrawing.
That's right.
It means activity.
And reclaiming.
And reclaiming.
Space that has been ceded
Exactly.
or lost or taken.
Exactly.
Well, I want to end just one of the great essays you wrote, sadly it wasn't for the Nation, but in a way was a precursor to this book, was an essay on solidarity. I want to say, was it 2005?
5, yeah.
But it's a term that often seems cliched, but is critical, I
Yeah.
think, in that collective self-governance.
Absolutely.
And reclaiming, retrieving small d. So thank you.
Thanks.
And